Hello friends, Anderson here. Welcome to my moment of even more self-indulgence than usual. This is the part where I raise my glass to you for sticking it out with Ironsworn Chapter 2 and look back on the things that stood out to me, the lessons learned, the challenges, things like that, in the hopes that you too may find this interesting and perhaps beneficial for your own games. I will try and keep it as non-rambly as I can. I've written up a few structural points to navigate through this little talk by, but this will not be a gameplay video, no actual play in this one. This is the wrap-up of the previous chapter, and the actual play will resume in the next chapter, but there'll be a few things in between that. Let's start with maybe the overall summary of my conclusions of KYNAN'S Story Chapter 2. It was a good result, I feel. I'm very happy with the narrative outcome. I liked how it did manage to pull together in the end. It was very fun to play in the sessions, in the moment, even though there were a lot of curveballs thrown my way, a lot of punches to roll with. But in between sessions, it was perhaps the most anxiety-inducing experience I've ever had in a role-playing game. Partly just because there was a point fairly early on where I started doubting my ability to bring this to a non-lackluster, satisfying conclusion in my own way of rating these things. I had many a moment where I thought, oh, it's gonna end this way, this is going to suck, and then the dice just threw it all in a completely different direction, or gave me something new to work with, or gave me a very unexpected result, and that really saved it for my taste and brought it to a very satisfying end. I've noted down a couple of challenges that I've faced during this particular chapter. And the first one of these was that it was a lot of firsts in this chapter. It was the first time meeting elves, it was the first time meeting Varu, it was the first encounter with Kalidas. Now, not all of those necessarily had to happen, but they were hard to avoid as well. The dice just had a mind of their own, and what was intended to be a quick and dirty, dangerous vow to knock out as almost part of an extended waypoint on the journey turned into a 23 video series just because there wasn't really a good way to get it back under control. And I think I didn't really try to get it back under control because I didn't really want to. I wanted to follow where the dice wanted me to go. And so we ended up introducing a lot of new things, a lot of lore about elves, a lot of lore about Varu, to a lesser extent at least. I had to kind of come up with how do I even envision a Varu to act, or what do I envision them to be like, to speak like, what do I think the elves are like in this version of the Ironlands. I had no preconceived notions for any of this and had to sort of build off of the canonical representations plus my own interpretation of them and what I picture these elements of the setting to be like. And I'm happy with the outcome. I think the elves are strange and alien enough to be at the same time sympathetic, but also terrifying. The Varu they almost came off as a little bit too positive in my view. I think they might have, in my view on this kind of narrative, benefited from a bit more black and shadow in their overall mix-up, because they were very light gray. I feel like on the coloration scale of dark fantasy, they're quite a friendly bunch, I have to say, which again is sort of an outcome of the dice, and I don't mind at all. It also isn't to say that they're all like this. There are very specific circumstances at play here, so probably the next ones we're going to run into are way more territorial and much less approachable. But part of the anxiousness about this was also a lot of these firsts, because I wanted to get it right the first time. Otherwise, I'm kind of forced to follow this design choice very early on, even though later on I maybe think, this doesn't really fit the theme I want to evoke. And there was a lot of kind of self-imposed pressure on getting these firsts all right. And especially when it comes to Kalidas, getting this first appearance right, getting his voice write to the limited extent of my abilities as a sort of a, for lack of a better term, voice. Basically my dungeon master voice. I was about to say voice actor, but that's really not what I am. It's like I am acting out things in a certain voice, and that is a voice that I try to keep consistent to the character, and I'm quite happy with the one I found for Kaladas. And I'm also quite happy with the voices I found for the Varu, even though they are kind of like Khajiit in Skyrim. It's just a big influence, and I don't mind it. It was quite fitting to me. I liked it. So the firsts were a big challenge and a big sort of pressure point, but they were eventually dealt with. The main gripe, or not gripe, the main sort of pit in my stomach, uncomfortable feeling I had during the entirety of this was that it always felt like a side quest that got out of hand. At least when I thought about it from a narrative construction and design perspective. I think of this series in terms of KYNAN'S background vow as the overall arc that it might follow. So between KYNAN'S vow to make Kaladas pay and now his additionally acquired vow to stop these true rulers of the Ironlands from coming back, that's kind of what's guiding us along. That is, in my way of thinking, the connecting point between these individual episodes. And if you want to compare it to something, I think it's less a novel or a movie and more like a collection of short stories jotted together by kind of a meta plot, or a series that has an overarching narrative but has also got its monster of the week. Just isolated episodes that stand on their own. But the challenge is always, like, I challenge myself in coming up with answers to the Oracle prompts to, as much as possible, use elements I've already introduced. So use characters, use situations, use callbacks, use background elements. If I can somehow shoehorn it in, I will. I don't want to introduce constant new things as answers to Oracle prompts and then never touch them again. It's a bit of a Chekhov's gun approach. If I show it to you, I also want to use it. That doesn't mean I'm always going to be able to do that or even want to do it with everything. Sometimes an NPC is just a one-off encounter and we'll never see them again, but more often than not, I'd want to try to give that encounter some lasting meaning or some callback or something. So weaving the overall narrative into this fairly unrelated side quest that explored more of the elven culture and this nightmare overlap and how that ties into the Iron Pillars and whatever Arsula and his sort of ideology were up to in trying to bring the nightmare to the world. It's also interesting to consider whether there are maybe other elves out there that follow a similar philosophy, particularly the ones that are older than humans. But that kind of divergence from, on the one hand, wanting to get that Kaladas vengeance thing going, and on the other hand, trying to follow this narrative was a challenge until I somehow accidentally hit upon this gloom and found a way to bring Kaladas in. And since I have this preference for introducing dream sequences only if they make some kind of impact, I also wanted Kaladas's consciousness to be affected there. So I wanted Kaladas in there in more than just a placative way where he's not just a reflection of KYNAN'S subconscious, but he's really there to engage and interact with. And then culminating in that sort of flashback sequence towards the very end, which was really that was very satisfying that this somehow came together just out of the question I was asking myself is how does a fight with a suspended nightmare father actually look? And then coming up with, well, you're probably going to have to face your own inner demons or your own regrets or the own sins of your past. So going with the characters through this sequence of past memories and altering them slightly, making them somewhat confusing, and having characters be there that take on the roles of other characters like Bastion, like Kaladas, that really tied it together for me and made it work, and also made it a good opportunity to show some of these facets of like what Kaladas is like, and having him voice a few lines and just getting an idea on what character we're actually dealing with. That was a good outcome, and that was partly the result of always trying to find a way to just grasp at strands of the meta narrative and tie it into the current side quest that we were on. That was a rewarding thing to do in game, but a horrible thing to think about between sessions, because I could never picture good scenarios, and I probably should stop trying to do that, but I can't help myself still, where that opportunity would present itself. I felt like there might be a risk that this side quest would just drift off way too far away from the narrative and themes I was trying to explore, while at the same time just bloating up by every little plot twist that kept piling on and piling on and piling on with these just insane die roll results that I have not seen the likes of, and I don't know what it is there. But in the end, I liked how it turned out. Like, every time I sat down and played a session, I got up feeling much more relaxed about it and going like, that's how you do that. Sure, yeah, it'll work. It's fine. And then like 2 days later, thinking about the next recording session, I was like, oh God, I don't know how am I going to pull this off. It's a bit exaggerated. I wasn't really agonizing over it, but it was one of these things where every time I sat down to record, I was much more curious about how am I going to get out of this one now? And how am I going to make this a cohesive narrative than pretty much ever before. This was way more of a challenge, also just due to its length, to get pulled together and get somehow woven into something that made sense. And in the end, I'm happy with how it turned out. So I guess that's that's the thing that'll stick with me. That's the thing that'll take away from this. Like that narrative will stay, and I'm happy with how it turned out. Another challenge I already touched upon was the length itself. I am almost sure that I've not covered everything. There are probably going to be some loose ends that I have forgotten about between starting this in, like, when was it, January or something, and wrapping it up now as we are in the middle of summer. So it is inevitable that in a narrative arc that spans like half a year almost, or more than that, in real time, things that get established in the second, third, or fourth recording session might just end up falling through the cracks because maybe they're not that relevant then anyway. Hopefully. Like, I hope I managed not to overlook something major, something big. I feel like the overall connection between the elements of the plot made sense. So the length itself, the length of time passed between the recording of the first session and the last one was difficult to deal with, even with taking notes and everything. And honestly, going back to rewatch the previous videos over and over again to refresh my memory is just not feasible in terms of production time. So I had to sort of trust my memory and my notes and hope that I don't overlook something really important. But it is something I'm thinking about. Maybe in terms of length overall, I should probably try and get that under control a bit better for the future, either by pre-recording a long stretch of a series and then taking sort of a mid-series finale approach and mixing up the different series on the channel a bit more that way. So having Ironsworn run for at most like 10 to 12 episodes per part of a chapter, bringing it to some kind of first break point, and then picking up there again a few weeks later after we've played a different game for a while, which gives me the opportunity to then do one full rewatch, do a little summary of the story so far at the start of the next recorded episode, and then probably miss less and keep it under control much better. So that is an approach I'm thinking about changing, just as an answer to the length, because that was a big problem. Some additional points maybe to take away. I really enjoyed Saskia as a protagonist, as little as she featured in this series. She disappeared quite early and was off screen, but still her presence was somehow always somewhere waiting in the wings. And once the opportunity presented itself to just bring her back and have her explore her own past a bit, and then bring it to that point in the epilogue of the finale where she just does her thing and does it in a, for my taste, fairly twisted but coherent way with how I picture her. If she pursues anything resembling a redemption arc, this will still be from the perspective of a person that in and of itself is not a good person. At least not anymore. And that has a long way to go even to even get close to that definition. Saskia is a really fun character to play and one of the most unexpected developments of the entire Ironsworn experience for me so far. Which also brings me a bit to the counterpoint to that with Kynan. Kynan is, due to his nature, due to his own fairly stoic approach, is fun to play, but his moments are few and far between. He is, as far as characters go, he's this canvas that you can play with, and he's got enough of a defined personality where you can occasionally have moments that he just does something borderline horrible but also amusing or entertaining, or says something, or that those moments are definitely fun and rewarding. But as a character, he is definitely more of an aggregator for the story than Saskia is, who is more of an agent of chaos. Like, as a protagonist herself, Saskia is much more proactive, whereas Kynan is a lot more reactive and doesn't initiate as much story as Saskia does. So for me, going forward, that also means I want to bring Saskia to the fore a bit more. I think there is a decent chance that the narrative gives us an opportunity to have more alone screen time for Saskia in the next chapter and have Kynan do some off-screen time, which then will also help to fix a gripe I've had with one of my choices in the very beginning of the series that I'm currently struggling with, and that is the sheer strength of Kynan as a character. I definitely regret picking this strong stat array for him now from the Lodestar reference guide here, which gives Kynan stats that are bumped up more than the average Ironsworn character, and that makes it so much more likely for Kynan to get at least a weak hit and also variously strong hits. And I'm already trying to find ways to justify just playing up his weak stats, but that does end up hitting limits where it just becomes contrived if I keep this up. So I picked this strong stat array for Kynan because I figured it's a long story arc and I want to give him a chance to survive it. But I didn't realize how easy it is to survive in the Ironlands. In this system, dying is definitely something of a choice. A whole lot of choice goes into even getting to the point where you can roll and then the outcome is your character dies, and even then there is still narrative means to bring them back. So overall, I think it wasn't the best idea to take the strong stat array, and using Saskia as a point of view character with a weaker stat array is a very nice change of pace for me, because then I can roll with a few more failures, roll with a few more weak hits, instead of getting a fairly staggering amount of strong hits, because that is really where the narrative shines and where the fun in Ironsworn is in failing and not in succeeding. So that for me is something to look forward to explore the facets of this game through different perspectives, different viewpoint characters. I'm not gonna become Game of Thrones here. This is already going to be a long narrative in and of itself, which is a challenge in and of itself, which I will eventually also need to find an answer for. Like, now we're 2 chapters in, I think I probably need, at least after the 3rd chapter, to make a sort of summary to catch up a new viewer and not just expect a new subscriber to go through 60-something videos and get to the point where we now last left off. But that's a bridge to cross at some point down the road. For the moment, I do relish the idea of broadening the spectrum of characters a bit while also tightening up the narrative into shorter sprints and then mixing it up a bit more with other games. That's kind of the plan for the future. I think one last thing I have noted down that I want to touch on is not really a challenge for me, but something I needed to be mindful of with this particular quest we had, which was to find Asha and keep her safe. At least one of the quests we had was, and that brought me to the question of NPC agency, because what I didn't want was Asha to be this kind of damsel in distress who is kind of a passive prop to be rescued by Kynan. That sounds horrible, overdone, dead and buried. This just doesn't interest me, this kind of story. So I wanted to avoid that, but it's such a deeply ingrained, stupid trope that it took a lot of mindfulness just to constantly keep in mind the NPC agency here, to make sure that whatever action happens doesn't just make this presumably crafty, witchy woman out to be some idiot who just constantly gets bonked on the head or needs rescuing all the time. I'm not sure whether I'm 100% satisfied with it, but I think I at least got the point across that she is a dangerous person who has her own agency and who has her own plans and who has her own engagement with the world and doesn't just rely on the hero to show up to be a nice prop for. It did end with Asha and Eren being somewhat unceremoniously disposed of at the end, but that I think is fair in the sense of strength differential between what is logical for Saskia to do and what she's able to pull off physically versus her having a badly injured and old woman to contend with. So for me, that was kind of that will help Saskia's character growth, and it's not really taking agency away from Eren or Asha if they're killed off. It's just kind of the consequence of their own action, which is agency in of itself. You have to live with the consequence of your own actions. But that was a challenge, and that will be a challenge for any other narrative arc. I don't want to experience this story where everything revolves around the heroes. There aren't any heroes anyway, but our point of view characters shouldn't be the switch that turns on an NPC into action or makes them just a prop for Kynan or Saskia to do stuff. And I think that's generally a good NPC design philosophy to live by. It's always something Ironsworn is definitely helpful in reminding you of by giving you these NPC goals and traits and everything, so you're already able to navigate through some touch points that give you a map of the NPC and what they want. But I think it's generally a good thing to keep in mind when running non-player characters, that in their own world they are the protagonist and they also have the agency of their own designs and plots, and they should occasionally win. In any case, that does it from my retrospective on Chapter 2. Going forward from this point on, I will, at the point when this video goes up, I will still be on vacation. And when I come back, there will be Disciples of Bone and Shadows for a while. Then there will be Scarlet Heroes for a while. Each of those will not be longer. Like Disciples, probably 4 to 6 episodes. Scarlet Heroes, probably somewhere 8 to 10. And then we'll bring back Ironsworn either concurrently with one of them towards the end or after. So it might be a while before Ironsworn comes back. And then Ironsworn comes back. Ironsworn will have its 10 to 12 episodes, hopefully culminating in some kind of finale or mid-season finale or however you want to call it. And then we'll swap again. That's sort of the idea. All the while, we'll keep world building and we'll keep doing other stuff. I'll keep showing you stuff that I get in the mailbox. I still have to make a video about this whole Warlock bundle here and compare it to the other Warhammer, Oldhammer Retro clone, Zweihander, and the 4E Warhammer. That's something I want to do. So there's stuff planned. There are many ideas I have. Starforged, Forge Rats, I'm also still working on and continuing, but probably at a lower pace, probably like 1 a month to 2 a month at most. And eventually Starforged, the physical copy, will come out. Then I'll have to figure out what to do with that and when to weave that in. Strider mode is something I'm very interested in. Playing a OSR game is something I'm very interested in. So there's a lot of things to do and maybe not quite enough time to do it in. But there's no rush either. So we'll get to it in due time, eventually, and it's always my goal when I start telling a story to finish it. So that's the best I can do for now, is to just one step at a time bring the narrative closer, and who knows, maybe by 2027 Kynan's story will be over. That's a rough estimate. So for now, I thank you very much for sticking with me, for tuning in, for watching, for leaving your comments, for engaging with the stories I put out there. I'm very happy with how this has gone over the last year, and I will keep uploading, so I appreciate it if you keep watching. And until then, bye for now.